They said the walls at ADX don't talk, but the men who live inside them eventually do. The transport van stopped like it had hit something invisible. No one spoke. No one breathed too loudly. The guards stepped out first, scanning the icy Colorado air as if danger could materialize from the mountains themselves. Inside the van sat a man no one wanted to be responsible for, a federal inmate newly reclassified as life without parole, the kind of inmate ADX Florence keeps locked down not for what he might do, but for what he might inspire. If stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe, because this one only gets darker. He stepped out in full restraints, wrists, ankles, waist. Not because he'd fight, he'd long given up on that, but because the protocol required nothing less. Death row inmates and whole life inmates at ADX move through a system that treats every footstep like a security threat. The intake corridor felt colder than the air outside. A fluorescent hum vibrated through concrete walls thicker than a bank vault. The inmate was escorted past sealed doors, each one shutting behind him with a hydraulic sigh that sounded almost human. ADX Florence wasn't built to punish impulse. It was built to erase possibility. From the start, the rules were different for him. No step down. No group programs. No job assignments. No chance to be transferred to anything less restrictive. He had one of the most suffocating statuses in the federal system, permanent supermax confinement, with special administrative measures controlling every scrap of communication he tried to send beyond these walls. Every phone call. Every piece of mail. Every legal message. All filtered, reviewed, and sometimes delayed for weeks. To him, it felt like being buried alive with a breathing tube that someone else controlled. The guards marched him to his cell, a concrete box with a concrete bed, a concrete desk, a narrow slit of a window angled upward so he could see the sky but never the horizon. No neighboring voices. No footsteps from a cellmate. Just the metallic echo of his own movements bouncing back at him, reminding him that isolation wasn't an atmosphere here, it was architecture. During his first week, he learned the rhythm of ADX, a meal slot opening with a sudden clank. A guard's eyes appearing briefly in the security glass. The muted thump of doors opening along the tier for controlled movement. But he also learned what he wouldn't get. Other inmates, those not on death row or whole life status, could work toward lower security through behavioral programs. But his file was stamped with a sentence that ended the conversation before it started. On his 6th day, something unusual broke the monotony. He heard a scraping sound, soft, cautious, coming from the vent above him. He froze. In ADX, sound meant risk, either a guard, or an inmate who should not be able to communicate with anyone at all. The vent was supposed to be sealed. Soundproofed. Secure. The scraping continued. Then stopped. He stared at the vent for hours, waiting. Watching. Wondering. Was someone trying to reach him? Was it a mistake? Or was there a crack in a system that prides itself on perfection? When the sound returned the next night, this time clearer, deliberate, he pressed his ear against the concrete and whispered the first words he'd spoken to anyone in days. Someone whispered back. And that was the moment he realized ADX wasn't as silent as everyone claimed. The whisper that came through the vent didn't sound desperate or panicked. It sounded practiced. Controlled. As if the person on the other side already knew exactly how much risk he was taking. In ADX Florence, communication wasn't just forbidden, it was engineered to be physically impossible. For a whole life inmate or someone under SAMS, it was practically a myth. But myths survive for a reason. He listened again. The voice was faint, distorted by metal and distance, but he could make out a single sentence spoken with unsettling calm. They don't watch the walls as closely as they say. The inmate stepped back instinctively, glancing at the camera mounted above his door. It was motion activated. Always on. Always recording. Every movement, every reaction, captured. The voice in the vent continued, now quieter. Don't look up. Don't answer. Just listen. He wiped the sweat from his palms and paced the cell slowly, trying to make his movements look random. The voice spoke again, in short, staggered phrases, giving him time to walk in circles. What he learned over those minutes felt impossible. Somewhere on the same tier, likely several cells away, a long-term life-without-parole inmate had spent years studying the systems ADX prides itself on. Vent placements, sound leakage, maintenance errors, human habits. He wasn't planning an escape, he wasn't suicidal, he wasn't delusional. He was observant. And in a place like ADX, observation becomes power. Each night, the whisper returned. Never asking questions. Never giving a name. Never encouraging anything that could be considered coordination or planning. Instead, he explained things no one ever told incoming inmates: how certain guards walked the tier faster during evening rounds, how medical checks for death row inmates were scheduled but irregular, how communication logs were screened by different departments depending on classification. It wasn't just information. It was insight. And it was coming from someone who had accepted, long before this, that he would die inside these walls. The more the inmate listened, the more he started to notice details he'd missed before: the uneven buzz in the ceiling lights when the remote door systems were activated, the subtle delay between the outer pod door closing and the inner one locking, the momentary flicker in the hallway cameras during shift change. He wasn't looking for a way out. But he was finally beginning to understand the world he was trapped in. The real pressure started on the 9th night. This time the whisper wasn't calm. It was urgent. They moved someone into administrative segregation. High-status case. Under SAMs. You'll hear it soon. The inmate froze mid-step. Administrative segregation at ADX wasn't unusual, but moving a SAMS inmate in the middle of the night meant something had gone wrong. And wrong inside ADX rarely stayed quiet for long. As if on cue, heavy footsteps thundered across the tier. More guards than usual. More equipment. More tension in the air. He could hear the shuffle of chains, the distinct click of additional restraints, the hushed but sharp commands of officers who didn't want their voices recorded on the pod microphones. Then came something he never expected to hear through concrete and steel: a short, muffled plea. Not a scream. Not a shout. Just a strained, low protest, cut off almost as soon as it started. The whisper returned, softer now: that's why they don't let men like us move. When someone breaks, the whole prison feels it. The inmate backed into the corner of his cell, heartbeat slamming. He wasn't sure what unnerved him more, the commotion outside, or the eerie certainty in the whisper's tone. Then came the final message of the night: tomorrow, check your food slot before you take the tray. You'll understand everything. The vent went silent. The lights dimmed for the night cycle. And for the first time since arriving at ADX Florence, he wasn't afraid of isolation, he was afraid of what he might discover next. He barely slept. Every sound became a warning. Every flicker of the hallway light felt like the beginning of something he wasn't prepared to face. When morning arrived, the tray slot opened with its usual metallic snap, but this time, he didn't grab the food immediately. He remembered the whisper's warning. He leaned down slowly and looked at the cold steel ledge. There, pressed flat against the corner where the light didn't reach, was a folded scrap of paper no bigger than a thumbprint. Impossible. SAMs made unsanctioned notes nearly unthinkable. Life without parole inmates weren't given chances to pass messages, much less receive them. He slid it into his palm with one quick motion and stepped away from the door. Only when he was sure the camera angle couldn't catch the inside of his fist did he open it. One sentence. Written tiny, tight, and deliberate. They're watching your vent. His throat tightened. Not because he feared punishment, they didn't need a reason to shut down movement for weeks if they suspected rule breaking, but because the warning meant the whisper hadn't been imagined. Someone had risked everything to reach him. And someone else had noticed. The rest of the day moved like slow thunder. Guards walked the tier with a stiffness he hadn't seen before. Checks were more frequent. The silence between them felt sharper, like the air was holding its breath. In the afternoon, he heard movement near the segregation cells, the place where the whispering inmates supposedly lived. A distant door slammed. Another. Then another. No voices. No orders. Just the mechanical rhythm of a transfer, the kind that meant someone was being moved out of reach, or out of circulation. By evening, the vent was silent. No scraping. No whisper. Nothing but the faint, constant hum of the building's breathing. He waited through dinner. Through lights out. Through the dead hours when the prison felt suspended in time. Still nothing. It wasn't until after midnight that the truth hit him, not with a sound, but with the total absence of one. Whoever had been communicating through his vent was gone. Not necessarily harmed, but gone. Removed. Detained. Isolated even further than before. And that was all ADX needed to do to erase a voice, seal a door, reroute movement, change a classification code. He sat on the concrete bed and understood the message behind the disappearance. This place didn't just control inmates. It controlled the flow of reality itself. What you heard. What you saw. What you believed. All filtered through rules designed to keep every man locked not just behind walls, but inside a version of the world where hope was treated like contraband. He looked back at the tiny scrap of paper, the only proof that connection had existed at all. The handwriting was so small it almost vibrated under the cell's dim light. He made a deliberate choice then. He slid the note under the edge of his mattress, not to use it, not to pass it on, but to remember. Because in a place like ADX, memory was one of the last things they couldn't confiscate. Morning arrived again. A new guard delivered his tray. No tension. No extra eyes. Just routine. And that was the final twist, the most chilling one of all. ADX didn't need to explain what happened. It didn't need to warn him. It didn't even need to intimidate him directly. The silence did all of that on its own. He returned to pacing his cell, tracing the same pattern he'd been following since the day he arrived. 23 hours a day. Concrete. Steel. Light. Darkness. The world compressing around him, inch by inch. Yet inside that crushing routine, one truth stayed clear. Even in the most secure prison in the United States, the real power wasn't in the walls, it was in knowing what those walls decided to hide. And now he knew something he was never meant to learn. Whether that made him safer, or put him directly in their line of sight, was a question only ADX Florence could answer. If you think this story was intense, the next one will leave you speechless. Subscribe for more true crime stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat.